Podcasting from the beautiful state of Maine, welcome to another episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast, the show that focuses on identifying and developing the skills and behaviors that will inspire, empower, and compel others to follow your lead. Listen as Patrick's guests talk about the powerful leadership approaches they have identified and developed, which are vital for leading in today's challenging times. These are the same approaches that will positively impact you as a leader too. Learning from Leaders provides the right balance of leadership research with real-world scenarios, making it easy for you to rise above your best. All right, let's start the show.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Learning from Leaders. I'm Patrick Verino. I realize it has been quite some time since we've had an opportunity to talk about leadership challenges in the world today, and I want to thank you again for joining me on this one. Today's topic is about isolation and idleness and how I believe it has accelerated our level of intolerance with each other. And I would say on a global level, but certainly within the U.S. And that's really what I want to talk about today. How did we get to where we are? And from my own experience, this is really some of the dots that I've connected that I think has created it. And as leaders, I think it's important to recognize this and find solutions on how we can get out of this. What is it going to take? And you know my default on this, I always go back to it's about behaviors. It's simply about behaviors. As I was getting ready to put together this podcast, I've also been in the process of completing an introduction to a book that is hopefully going to be out within the first quarter of next year. And in that, I cite a date of April 7th, 2020. It was based on a virtual workshop that I was giving that was supposed to be an in-person workshop, but because of COVID and the lockdowns had been pushed to a virtual environment. I can remember back that far of the conversations on this is going to be 2 weeks and this is going to be a month. And the novelty of it in the beginning was kind of enjoyable. We did a number of different things at home, but as it dragged on and we were continually isolated, what did we do? We were watching case counts and the experts talk about where this was going and who was doing what and what you should be doing. And what I think very early on is it started to solidify based on what we read, what we watched, and we didn't have other competing opinions around us to question that, at least not in person. But what did we have? We had social media that we looked to see what were the comments on there. I think that's where things really started to go downhill, was because here we are, we're isolated, we're idle, that even if you're working, if you went to a remote work environment, I can promise you that people were not working remotely the same way they were working in an office, at least not the majority of people. There might be some of you out there with it that would say, I kept the exact same schedule, and kudos to you. Most of the mortals in this world did not work that way. Having been somebody that's worked in a home office for over 2 decades, I can tell you that there are even days where I become distracted and I have idle time. And how did we fill that up? With news, with trying to find out what was going on. And we started to build a picture of what we thought was the situation that we were experiencing. Well, as isolation or as lockdown started to loosen up a little bit, what did we do? We went to bubbles, right? We all heard about bubbles. Who's in your bubble? To try and keep things somewhat tight in terms of you tried to know like who was in your bubble? How were they protected? Well, you weren't in your bubble with somebody that wasn't of the same mindset as you were. So what did that continue to do? It continued to build a sense of narrative that we felt we were right. We were on the right side of science, on the right side of history on this, all of those things. What it did was it encouraged confirmation bias. And what I mean by that is that, right, we took a belief on something. It's very easy for us to get validated through people we're hanging around in our bubbles because they believe the same things. And we can reinforce that through social media, things like Facebook, because I can find the sites that are going to validate what I believe. And what's even, I think, more powerful is I was reading an article around the polarization in the US. And this was an article written by 2 authors who had published a book called The Coddling of the American Mind not that many years ago. And what was interesting about this book is that this series of articles was they tried to look back and say, where did things really start to change? And what they found was that things started to change on social media, where people became more polarized, was with the introduction of the like button. The like button. And what they found was that once the like button was added, and once Facebook did it, then Twitter did it, was that it created an opportunity for you to find out people that agreed with you, that were like-minded, just like you. That's a problem for us when we're talking about the push around diversity in the bigger scheme of things. We hear that word all the time. Well, we created less diversity when we were in isolation. We were around people more like ourselves than around people with varying viewpoints, which is also part of diversity. Now, even as our bubbles started to go away, we didn't need the bubbles, things loosened up even more. Today, we still have masks. Now, not everybody wears them, but masks are a continued form of isolation where there's a barrier between us and the other individual. I was at a grocery store not that long ago with my wife, and somebody passed us quickly and they had a mask on, and they said, "Hey, Patrick." And I didn't know who it was. I'd asked my wife, who was that? And she said, "Oh, that was Jim." And my guess is Jim didn't really want to have a conversation, especially with me, because I didn't have a mask on. So he could recognize me, but I couldn't recognize him. That was a form of isolation, that we don't see people. And in work that I do in organizations, talking about reading the environment, not being able to see people's facial expressions can be challenging in terms of knowing what's going on. That is a problem. That creates isolation. And again, when we have this type of isolation, it's a barrier. Now, there are several behaviors in a model that I talk about around cables that I think are highly relevant here. One of them is the B in that model of cables is around belonging. That due to isolation, we're in an environment where we lack the same type of belonging we had before. When we were out in our environments, when we would go to the office, if that's what you did, there weren't the barriers that there are now. And again, I think that's important from the standpoint of tolerating other people, because we share different viewpoints. In an office setting, we might share different viewpoints that were more acceptable because we saw multiple dimensions of the same person, that they weren't all about just this one issue, that maybe we disagreed about wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, but there were so many other things that I saw in you, that I was around you, that it didn't matter. And I think that's a big thing to recognize here, is that our isolation has created an environment where it's easier for us to be intolerant with other people. I think about this like a civility scale. And I talk about this in work that I would do with individuals or teams, is that there is a civility scale that we have, that what I say to somebody or might forward to somebody in an email or a text is much different than what I would say to that person face to face. And in the middle there is probably a phone call that I might say something to somebody that I wouldn't necessarily be as brave to say if we were face to face. A barrier there between us that provides some protection for me. A screen provides protection. A keyboard provides protection. And again, I think because of that, we create more intolerance. And the idleness component of this is that the more downtime that we had, again, even if you're working remotely, there are fewer outlets that people had. Going to games or going out for dinner or going to have drinks with friends. That created more idleness, more opportunities for us to have time that we normally would have found easier ways to utilize this time. So it might have forced us to, even if it was to think more about the issues that were going on. And I will tell you, I'm guilty of this, about ruminating on things where normally I would have other distractions to not think about that. People didn't have those. And to some degree, people still don't have those. And because of that, I think that idleness created an environment where we reinforced oftentimes those beliefs. And because of that, it reinforced our intolerance of beliefs or views that were different than our own. So how do we get out of this? How do we turn back the clock, so to speak, in regards to this intolerance? Well, again, I mentioned a model that I use called Cables, which is all about building bridges. And I talk about this in an article that I'm writing right now about bridging the divide between employee engagement and organizational excellence. Now, I'm talking about it from an organizational standpoint, but it doesn't matter. It can be anywhere. We're bridging the divide is really what we need to do right now. How do we do that? Well, a couple ways. One in this model called Cables, the first is around congruence. It's about walking the talk. Now, if we think about this from the standpoint of about wanting diversity or about demanding respect, well, if that's it, then how is it respectful for me to shout somebody down or to work on how to get them uninvited so that they can't give their viewpoint, right? There's nothing that is congruent about that if respect is something that I would say I want myself. So the next in this model of Cables about building these better relationship bridges is appreciation. And appreciation involves two different components here. One that's more relevant, I think, for this conversation is around recognizing others for who they are, for their differences. We don't do enough of that. We're talking about recognizing people for their perspectives, for maybe what experiences that they've had and why they've made the decisions that they've made. Look at it from a standpoint of masks or no masks, or get vaccinated, don't get vaccinated. To me, this has been a case study in how to influence people or not influence people. That the more somebody is told that they're stupid because they didn't get the vaccine, or they're selfish because they didn't get the vaccine, I don't know anybody that says, oh, well, thank you. You know, I never realized that I was selfish, or I never realized how stupid I was. There are reasons. Do I agree with them? No. But that doesn't really matter in that I don't fully understand all of what went into their experiences, what made their decisions, how they made the decisions. And quite frankly, if I want to persuade them to get a vaccine, then it would be in my best interest to find a way to listen to what their resistance is to getting that. Not so that I can respond or that I can undermine, but I can listen to understand. And we'll get to that in a minute. So the B in this model is around belonging. And if you think about it, what have we done with isolation? And then moving out into bubbles. We created environments where you were either on the inside or the outside. You were either for us or against us. It became very binary, right? You're either on the right side of this or the wrong side. There's no moderate position here. Now, what's interesting is there was a citation in this article that I was reading about the polarization of America. And they cited a study called The Hidden Tribes. And in this study, it was published in 2018 by the UK, by a UK group, I should say, called More in Common. Now, they surveyed 8,000 Americans in December of 2017. So this is before the pandemic. What's interesting here is they were able to classify groups, I think, into 5 different categories on basically a scale. So you can think about this. The first group was what they called devoted conservatives. So this group made up 6% of the population. So on the other side of this, they found progressive activists, and that group made up 8% of the population. Now, what was interesting is that although, as they said, devoted conservatives and progressive activists made up just 14% of the U.S. population, they wielded enormous influence on American political discourse as they passionately expressed their hatred for each other, right? To me, what gets even more interesting here is they talk about the devoted conservatives were the whitest of all, and there were 7 groups, of all 7 groups. 88% of the devoted conservatives were white. What was something unexpected in this was that the progressive activists, so the far right group, were the second whitest group at 80%. It goes on to say that likewise, it may not surprise you to learn that progressive activists who were the most highly educated reported the highest annual income, but that the second wealthiest group was the devoted conservatives. So here we have two groups. On the far left and the far right, they seem to be the most educated, the wealthiest, the smallest group, yet they drive most of what I would say more moderate people would want to see happen. When we're more isolated, when we're more idle, and we see this type of behavior, where does the news go? They live in the fringes, the extremes, which I think has promoted an environment where there's less tolerance because this is what we see going on. We've had too much time to deal with this stuff. You always hear that. This person has too much time on their hands. Usually when they're thinking about things that most of us wouldn't even want to think about anymore, you're like, you got too much time on your hands. Well, that's exactly what's going on here. So we move from belonging, and I mentioned earlier that I was going to talk about listening. Listening has gone from listening to respond, which was bad enough. I'm not really listening to you. I'm just going to listen well enough so that I can make a counter argument. And in the environment that we're in right now, and I would say as it relates to what I just mentioned here in this Hidden Tribes survey or study, is that we've now gone to listening to undermine. And think about things like the cancel culture. That is about listening to undermine. I don't like what you say. I will find a way to basically silence you. Now, I might not like what somebody else says, but who am I to silence that person? And I think it is a dangerous road that we go down when we want to start deciding who's on the right side of this, because what it will do is there is a time that maybe we're not on the right side, or the right side that we think is the right side, and things start getting canceled or restricted that become much more questionable. So when we talk about listening, we really talk about listening in four different ways. We talk about listening with our eyes, our ears, our mind, which is around curiosity, and listening with our heart, which is around empathy. And we need all four. If we're really going to create an environment where we become more tolerant of others, listening is one of our vital tools here. And listening in a way that truly demonstrates to the other person that we are committed to trying to understand where they're coming from, as opposed to just respond or undermine them, requires all four of those. I'm listening with my ears by listening to the words you say, the tone of voice. I'm listening with my eyes by watching your body language, by paying attention to you, not doing other things, not looking at my text or other people in the room, but I'm focused on you. Listening with curiosity, with my mind, of questioning, like, what is it that you're trying to say to me right now? Or what might I be missing about what you're saying? And then listening with the heart or with empathy is about trying to put yourself in the other person's shoes. If I were in their shoes, how would I want them to listen to me? When you listen on all four of those, it's very difficult to be intolerant. Doesn't mean you can't disagree, but you're certainly not going to be intolerant because you have invested yourself in terms of curiosity, of trying to understand where they're coming from. And the last part of this is around what we call specifics or clear expectations. What do we need from each other? And if we think about where we are today, so many things continue to move around and be unstable in regards to the narratives we're told and what's going on and what's safe and what isn't safe. There are no clear expectations. And when we don't have that, we run into conflict. We run into problems. We need clear expectations. What are the guidelines? How long will this last, right? Some things can't be answered, but that's where those other behaviors can help to address this in ways that it doesn't become as irritating to not have clear expectations. Because I know it's not just because things are being hidden from me, it's because some things we just don't know right now. But when we act like we know them and we don't, that's when we run into problems. So as you can see, isolation and idleness, both of those make a nasty combination as it relates to creating intolerance. And as you can see, when we're isolated And when we're idle, our level of tolerance for other people can quickly slip away from us. The behaviors that I've mentioned turn the tide on that. You don't have to do them all at once. I'd ask you to pick one. Maybe it's listening. You're going to focus on listening on all 4 of those ways this week. Just do that and see what happens. We can do better. We need to do better. I hope you found this episode helpful and challenging and thought-provoking. And until our next episode, I hope you can go out there and rise above your best.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Learning from Leaders podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on your preferred podcast listening platform. We really appreciate that effort. Until next time, keep rising above your best as a leader.